What's up everyone, my name is Ken, welcome to my channel. I mainly play Dynasty Warriors 5 Stream Legends on the highest difficulty, which is Chaos. My main is Ling Tong and I've made a bunch of different playlists, which you can find in the description. Today I'm proud to present the fruit of my labor, the very first version of my tier list. Before watching this video, I recommend watching my terminology video, link in the description below, to understand the terms I'll be using in this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. But before we get into it, let's go over some ground rules. For this tier list, I'll be judging every character in the game based on Dynasty Warriors 5 Stream Legends gameplay, meaning the enemies who have longer flinching time, and every character will have access to the Stream Legends exclusive items such as Dragon Arms and True Way of Musou. For this first version of the tier list, I'll optimize each character based solely on their fourth weapon, meaning their weapon stats are predetermined and they'll have access to a rage token every 100 kills. What this means is the quality of their fourth weapon will contribute a lot into their placement as well as how well they maximize their rage damage. There are characters that have much more potential than their ranking in this tier list, but are held back by their terrible fourth weapons, such as Sun Jian, Xin Kai, Huang Zhang, Liu Bei, Tai Shi Chi, and many more. In the future, I plan on making a tier list where these characters are allowed to customize their own third weapon to use instead of their bad fourth weapon. I'll be judging every character's moveset based on their performance in a 5-star Chaos mode. To know which stages are 5-star in the game, check out my Ling Tong Chaos mode playlist. Link is in the description below. So there are 5 criteria to rank a character: how safely they feel Musou, how much damage and coverage their Musou has, how well they do with a crowd, how well they duel an officer, as in fighting them without a Musou, and their overall offense speed. Based on these 5 criteria, it should be possible to determine how well a character will perform on Chaos. Personally, I prioritize safety over damage, meaning characters that deal damage slowly but are safer to play like Meng Huo, Xin Kai, and Xu Huang will be placed higher than characters that can potentially deal much higher damage but are unsafe to play like Tai Shi Chi and Sun Quan. So, the professional chaos clearing community of Dynasty Warriors 5 Stream Legends has a lot of restrictions when playing chaos, such as you're not allowed to use horse combat, you're not allowed to use any bodyguard, you're not allowed to consume a health recovery item, you must kill every officer and lieutenant in the map, so on and so forth. The purpose of this was to consistently measure how fast each character can clear a specific stage, and I totally respect that. However, stage clearing speed is not my focus here. My main goal on Chaos mode is to survive. But there are some stages where offense speed, especially officer killing speed, is important to survival, such as Body Castle on Wu side and Mount Key in Legend mode. I will take that into consideration. I personally have only 2 restrictions. The first one is you're not allowed to use a fan bodyguard since they have an overpowered healing ability that makes Chaos not challenging anymore. It's not a hard ban, mainly because I'm not that good at the game, so I still require them for some weak characters. But if a character has to rely on one to survive, they are an automatic low tier. The second restriction is you're not allowed to skip an officer, meaning you're not allowed to run away from an officer once you encounter them. Again, this isn't a hard ban because I have broken this rule, but only for very few characters. This rule is not to be confused with following the path of least resistance because that one is allowed. For example, if a character is facing an officer and a lieutenant at the same time, it is completely legal by my standard to kill the officer first and make the lieutenant retreat. And you only have to kill any officer you encounter on the way to the enemy commander. You don't have to kill every enemy officer on the map. And on stages where there are multiple ways to reach the enemy commander, you're allowed to pick the easier one, such as taking the roundabout way to fetch Zhang Liao and avoid Lu Bu in Hulao Gate, or successfully executing Zhuge Liang's strategy in Mount Qi to avoid fighting 10 hyper officers who are all heading to you. With all that out of the way, let's get started. First, we have the top tier. These are the characters that can clear all 5-star stages with relative ease. We have Lu Bu. Unflinching and unblockable C1 makes it a great tool for when being surrounded by a crowd. His C3 is omnipotent and is probably the best charge attack in the whole game. It is a great filler, it can be used to control a crowd, and is a decent freezer. His Musou ending is also very safe. In terms of weakness, I guess you can say that his Musou damage is kinda mediocre for being the best character in the game, but it is not bad by any means. And he has the option to freeze an enemy, so against hyper officers, I guess you can freeze them before executing his Musou attack. Next, we have Ma Chao. He has the best mounted combat moveset in the entire game, which makes him the safest character in the whole game by far. On foot, his jump charge is very safe filling tool. During rage, he can freeze enemies with a C1 to maximize rage damage. And pretty much the only time where he needs to dismount is when he is in rage mode, I guess. In terms of weakness, his Musou hitbox is really wonky, so it's gonna take some time to master. Also, his offense speed is not that fast for a top tier character, so for some reference, his offense speed, I would say, is around the same level as Zhao Yun and Zhang Liao, both of whom are in the lower end of high tier. Next, we have the high tier. These are all the characters that can theoretically clear all 5-star stages, but will struggle with a few of them. And this is just my bias speaking because I am a Ling Tong main, but I'm gonna put him at the top of this tier. So he is the fastest runner in the game, he has the second fastest square string in the game, and his C4 is the best C4 in the game in terms of filling, crowd control, dueling an officer, and most importantly, it is the best freezer, which can make his Musou very high damage. He also has a jump charge that can scatter a crowd, but I rarely use it. In terms of weakness, his Musou has an ending delay, but this can be negated with his C1 escape move. And he can be a bit vulnerable if his C4 is blocked, but this rarely happens when you're fighting only one officer at a time, because when you turn your back against an officer as you are executing your C4, you can trick the AI into not blocking your C4, which will knock them on the ground. So he is only unsafe against multiple officers as one, but this weakness can be negated with a Musou rage. Next is Zhu Qi. His C4 is high damage and range, and is also a very good freezer. It has a slight pre-charge delay, but it can be safe when used in combination with a jump charge cancel or with a C1. C6 is safe in small crowds, and he has the strongest juggling Musou in the entire game. Also, his mounted charge attack is very safe for filling. In terms of weakness, like I mentioned, both his C4 and C6 has a pre-charge delay. With a more ideal third weapon that is lightweight, both of these moves can be safer. Also, his C4 beam wall has holes in them, so some enemies might slip through if you execute it too close to them. And his fourth weapon is absolutely terrible. For a high tier character, he has one of the worst fourth weapons. Next up is Pang De. He has the second best mounted moveset in the game, but slower and worse range than Ma Chao. He has a very high damage, non-juggling ground Musou, but it is a bit unversatile and has an ending delay. To make up for it though, his true Musou has a good ending. His jump charge is a decent escape move from a crowd. In terms of weakness, he is one of the slowest runner in the game, and he also has almost the slowest square string in the game. Next is Zhuge Liang. He has the second best Musou damage in the game with the fourth weapon setup. His jump charge is very reliable for range filling, and for close range filling, you can use his light orb and C4. In terms of weakness, his long Musou bar makes filling more unsafe, and his fourth weapon also doesn't have attack or speed, which means he has to run longer to fill. His ground square string is absolutely terrible, and his C1 to C6 is not that great except for C4, which you could use for close range filling as I mentioned above. His jump charge landing can also be vulnerable if you execute it way too close to an enemy crowd. And next, we have Dakiel. She has the best heavy weapon in the game, so her moveset is very high damage. C4 and C6 plus jump cancel is good for filling, freezing, and crowd control. The fifth hit of square string can create an infinite loop in small crowds, so you can use that against an enemy officer when you're dueling him. And also, because she is a heavy weapon wielder, she has a very unique unflinching property when she is attacking. In terms of weakness, her Musou hitbox is very strange. Sometimes it doesn't hit an enemy right in front of you, but will hit an enemy only at a distance, so that's that. And also, her C6 has a pre-charge delay, so if you're gonna use her C6, make sure that an officer doesn't block the fifth hit of your square string. So Dongzhu is a commander zone user just like Liu Bei, Sun Xian, Sun Quan, and maybe Cao Cao. Among them, he has the strongest and safest non-juggling Musou with a great ending. He also has a great fourth weapon with both attack and defense and horse, and he doesn't have a long Musou bar, so he can fill relatively fast on horseback and on foot with his square string. In terms of weakness, he has absolutely no reliable charge attack on foot, so if you finish his square string among a crowd and you still haven't filled up your entire Musou bar yet, you will be vulnerable, so use him carefully. Next we have Sima Yi. He has the best Musou damage in the game with the fourth weapon setup. He also has the best stationary true Musou because the ending is unblockable. And similar to Dongzhu, he will fill primarily on horseback, or he can also fill with a light orb C4 just like Zhuge Liang. But in terms of weakness, he fills very slowly on both horseback and on foot with C4, mainly because just like Zhuge Liang, his square strings really suck. So the first three normal attacks can be unsafe in a big crowd, and against a big crowd, only hit them with the C4 if you want to fill up your Musou bar. Also, if you are caught in a big crowd, you are pretty vulnerable because unlike Dongzhu, you cannot fill with just your square string alone, so be mindful of that. Next, you have Shou Tai. Among the three horsemen of the game, Ma Chao, Pang De, and Shou Tai, he is the weakest, but because he is a horseman, he can still fight very safely on horseback. In terms of weakness, even though his Musou is a non-juggling Musou, it is the worst non-juggling Musou in the entire game, so not very high damage at all. And just like Dongzhu, he doesn't have a reliable charge attack on the ground, so he will have to rely on square string if he wants to fill up his Musou on the ground. But because of his long Musou bar, it's not very reliable. So Xiao Yun can be a bit of a complex character to play. His C1, C4, C5, and C6 are all viable, but not one of them is especially reliable. C1 is safe and unflinching, but fills very little Musou and has a pre-charge delay. C4 has a good range, but also has pre-charge delay. C5 activates in front of you, so it's good for dueling and freezing an officer, but bad for crowd control. C6 has less delay than C4, but also a more risky square string to get to before you actually execute the move, and just like C4 is a decent freezer. Finally, Xiao Yun has a great true Musou ending. In terms of weakness, he requires both Way of Musou and Dragon Arms to be safe, so there is no place for true Way of Musou, meaning less Musou damage, and his Musou damage is kinda weak without freezing. Also, because there are so many moves for you to remember, he is not the easiest character to play. Next we have Zhang Liao. His C6 and jump cancel combo is good for filling, but you have to know how to hit an enemy in a crowd to not let them swarm your back, because if you use him without a prior practice, his C6 is very prone to being swarmed from behind by an enemy crowd. C3 is faster but a riskier alternative to fill his Musou because less hit and it covers less range. And his Musou is non-juggling, so it deals a considerable amount of damage. But in terms of weakness, he has a case of Identity Flute Musou, meaning that even though his normal Musou doesn't juggle, his true Musou does juggle, which reduces the damage by half. Also, his C6 has a pre-charge delay. That's why he's very prone to being surrounded by a crowd, so keep that in mind. Next up, we have Wei Yan. His C3 and jump charge combo is a very fast filling combo. He has a juggling Musou, but it has good hit rate, so he still does some decent damage. In terms of weakness, his jump charge ending is very susceptible to being surrounded, so you have to practice with him to know when to use his jump charge cancel versus when to use his jump square cancel. And he's not a very reliable freezer, so it'll be hard to maximize his Musou damage compared to everyone else in this tier list. And yeah, he is overall just a very hard character to use safely, so you'll have to practice with him a lot. Next, we have Karen. His C3 is great for range filling, Light Orb C6 and Jump Cancel for close range filling. And because he has the unflinching characteristic of heavy weapon user like Dak Yeo and Sun Shangshang, his C1 becomes a very good panic move when you're surrounded by a crowd. Also, his non-juggling Musou is very safe because of the stomping ending. In terms of weakness, he has a lightweight weapon, so Musou damage isn't optimized, and his two most reliable charge attack for filling, C3 and C6, both have a pre-charge delay. Even though he has a lightweight weapon, his square string is still kind of slow. Also, his third square is kind of unsafe, so you have to practice with him to know how to use him. And finally, the last character in this tier is Xingkai. She is kind of a one-trick pony. Her C3 and jump charge cancel is very safe for filling in most crowd sizes. In terms of weakness though, she has low Musou damage and mediocre freezing rate. Also, her fourth weapon has no attack attribute, so she is gonna have a very slow offensive speed compared to every other character in this tier. The only reason that I'm including her in this tier is because there's still a small chance of her actually freezing someone with her C3, so Musou damage is still higher than most of the characters in the tier below her. Next is the almost high tier. These are the characters that can clear most 5-star stages, but not all of them. The issue is that they either have fast offense but slightly unsafe defense, or they have very safe defense but very slow offense, and some stages will punish you for that. First, we have Gan Ning. He is a very fast runner, and he also has a very fast square string with his fourth weapon. His C5 is great for crowd control and dueling, and his C6 is great for freezing. C1 is good for scattering a crowd, so he has multiple options of dealing with any crowd size and any officer. The big issue with him is that his Musou is very hard to use, and he also has a case of Identity Flute Musou, so unless you freeze an officer on the ground, it is very hard to reliably maximize his Musou damage. We have Shu Huang. His C3 is good for filling and crowd control, maybe freezing, and he has an unblockable JC. The issue with Shu Huang is that he has a very low damage Musou because of his low hit rate, and ideally, he would be best with a heavy weapon instead of a light weapon, and with a heavy weapon, we can abuse his jump charge to fill Musou, and then once his Musou bar is full, we can very reliably kill an officer with it instead of the current setup, which has a very slow offense. Next is Meng Huo. Meng Huo is basically just a slower Gan Ning. His C1 and jump charge cancel is great for filling in any crowd size. His C3 plus jump charge cancel is good for dueling and freezing, so he can be very safe in big crowds. He can deal with any crowd size, but I would argue that he is the best in very big crowds. And just like the two characters above him, he has a very low damage Musou and low officer killing speed, so that's his weakness. Fu Shi is basically a slower Meng Huo. His jump charge can be jump cancel, and I don't know if this is a glitch or they intended it, but he is the only character in the entire game who can do this, creating an infinite burning jump charge loop. So he is very safe in big crowds, just like Meng Huo. The drawback is that his Musou has terrible hit rate and hitbox, and he also has no good freezing option, which means that he has very slow offense. Next is Zhang Fei. His C3 is good for crowd control and freezing, and he's one of the best freezers in the game. The issue with him though is that his first 2 squares is very unsafe, so he is not good in a big crowd, and his C3's execution time is also quite long. Instead of hitting the enemy 2 times like other characters, his beginning sequence has 3 hits, so it's only after the 3rd hit that his blue shockwave activates to freeze an enemy. Also, he has terrible running speed. Just like Dong Zhuo, Liu Bei is a commander Thorn user. His C6 is a good Musou filler, but it can be unsafe because of the pre-charge delay and post-charge delay. It can be safer with Dragon Arms and Light Orb to negate the post-charge delay. Also, he has kind of a shuriken jump charge that releases a projectile to scatter enemy forces to make his C6 safer. So you run away, you use jump charge to scatter the enemy crowd to make it less big, and then you use your C6. That's the way to go with Liu Bei. Also, he has a strong Musou even without the attack stat on his 4th weapon. In terms of weakness, his Musou ending has 3 vertical hits, which can sometimes lead to him being surrounded by a crowd. Also, his first 5 normal attacks can be vulnerable in a big crowd. That's why you need to jump charge to scatter the crowd first. His C3 can be a faster alternative, but it feels less and risky when you finish it with no full Musou bar. Because of his 4th weapon, he also has a long Musou bar, which isn't ideal because none of his filling options are super dependable. Yuan Shao is yet another commander Thorn type. He has no viable charge attack, just like Dong Zhuo, which means he fills exclusively on horseback. But his 4th weapon doesn't have any attack, so his offense is lower than Dong Zhuo and Sima Yi. But what he does have though is a very safe true Musou ending, which makes his playstyle mostly safe. In terms of weakness, same as Sima Yi, he has a very slow offense, and he can be vulnerable in big crowds without Musou. But unlike Sima Yi, his Musou damage is nowhere near as high, so he has even slower offense. So Lu Meng is kind of a special case. He doesn't have a reliable charge attack to fill his Musou on the ground. That's why he is also an exclusive mounted charge character. But at the same time, he doesn't have the same weakness as some other characters who also fill exclusively on horseback, like Sima Yi and Yuan Shao. His square string is very safe, and he has a shorter Musou bar, so it fills faster. His C6 is sometimes useful, so he is safer in a crowd with no Musou, just like Dong Zhuo, when compared to either Sima Yi or Yuan Shao. In terms of weakness though, he does have a case of Identity Flute Musou, and his normal Musou ending is quite unsafe, and because of his Identity Flute Musou, he doesn't deal as much damage during rage. Next we have Zhurong, also a character that fills exclusively on horseback because her charge attacks are unreliable. She has the same playstyle as Yuan Shao and Lu Meng, but her stationary Musou is much stronger but also less versatile. Her normal Musou ending is safer than Lu Meng. In terms of weakness, she has the same weakness as Yuan Shao and Sima Yi, but at the same time, she also has trouble isolating an officer within a crowd to inflict Musou damage on him. Next, we have Sun Qian, also another Thorn commander. His C5 and jump cancel is very good for filling, and yeah, just C5, jump cancel, run away, and then C5, jump cancel again until your Musou bar is full. He has a strong Musou despite not having the attack stat and having a lightweight weapon. And the last thing about him is that his true Musou ending is quite safe. In terms of weakness, his 4th weapon is kinda garbage. It is lightweight, it has no attack attribute, no speed attribute to support him running away from a crowd, and it gives him a very long Musou bar, which makes it hard for filling. Also, his normal Musou ending is very unsafe. Next, we have Lu Xun. He has very fast running speed like Ling Tong and Gan Ning, and he also has a fast shuriken jump charge, just like Liu Bei, which means you can exclusively use it to fill Musho. The fast fireball C1 is what I use to disperse an approaching crowd to burn them before a Musho. In terms of weakness, he has a case of identity flute Musho, so his Musho during rage is very hard to maximize. Next we have Nuwa. The 3 hits of her C1 and jump charge cancel is good for filling Musho. Her mounted charge attack is also good for filling, and her stationary non-juggling Musho is strong. Alternatively, I also use her C3 and C4 to fill sometimes, but both of those moves are quite unreliable. In terms of weakness, she has the fastest square string in the entire game, but it has horrible range. And her jump charge ending jumps backward instead of forward, just like Xingkai, making it less safe. Yue Ying has C6 and jump cancel for filling, crowd control and freezing, and she's kind of a one-trick pony with this combo. Maybe there's some other way to use her, but I have not found out how to do so, other than her C6. And in terms of drawback, she has no way to scatter a big crowd other than on horseback. Her third square is a vertical, and her Musho is kinda weak. Unless she can freeze the crowd with her C6, her Musho damage is kind of weak. Finally, in this tier, we have Xiahou Dun. His C3 is good for keeping enemy from surrounding him in a small crowd, while his C6 is better for filling in a bigger crowd. His tier list placement is kind of a theoretical one because I have seen some other players who play him very safely, but for some reason, I personally cannot play this character safely at all, so because of that, I'm gonna place him here. In terms of weakness, he has a relatively unsafe Musho ending, and just like Wei Yan, he is very hard to master and play safely. And that was it for this video. We have tackled 29 out of 50 playable characters in this game, so that's a considerable number. If your favorite character did not show up in this video, I'm sorry, but that doesn't mean that they are unviable. It just means that you're gonna need way more practice to play them safely on Chaos. And you just have to accept that some stages are not made for them, and that's okay. But yeah, in the next video, we'll be looking at the mid tier and the low tier. For those characters, they're gonna have some issue with their defensive setup and the way that their moveset works on Chaos. So look forward to that. Peace!